Jayson Stark in. We've had a lot of Pete Rose calls and talks in the first hour, and obviously Pete spoke right at the top of our show. We didn't get a chance to see or hear what he had to say, just kind of following social media. So we'll start with that, Jayson. First off, thanks for joining us and just popping back on. And I don't know if you got a chance to see Pete, but how did you think he came off today on ESPN?
Mike, I did not see it.
Okay.
So you're asking the wrong guy about that. But I did see some of the stuff that he said yesterday, and I think it's pretty clear that this is a guy who's kind of in denial about what happened to him, how it happened to him, and why Rob Manfred decided what he decided. You can't just say, I've reconfigured my life. You actually have to do something about it. And the fact that he was still betting on baseball after being suspended for life by betting on baseball, that really tells us how little penetrated, Pete's brain there, don't you think?
I tell you, absolutely. And I think a lot of people would make that, case for Pete that, look, even in all these years, he's been in denial. He's never truly been contrite. He's never really, felt bad. It almost feels like he doesn't feel bad about what he did. He feels like he didn't do anything wrong. And as you write over at ESPN.com, Jay, that this is one of the saddest tales, not only in baseball, but in the history of sports, and that finally it seems like the door has been closed on Pete ever getting back in the game.
Yeah, I know that Rob Manfred said yesterday when he did that interview with ESPN that Pete could still apply again for reinstatement, but let's face it, they just did a full 1-year study of the Dowd report and all that led to his suspension in the first place, and what he's done with his life since. He had a chance to sit with Rob Manfred, answer questions, have a conversation, plead his case, work his magic. Didn't work. And here's the reason that I think that's a sad story. I recognize there are sadder stories in the world, but when you think about what happened yesterday and compare it with what should have happened, when you think back on Pete's career, that's where the sadness comes in. We're talking about a guy who got more hits than anyone who ever lived, who had a certain charisma about him, who had a work ethic that really drove him to the heights he reached. This is a guy who should have been an American folk hero. He had so many chances to do what needed to be done and say what needed to be said in order to get reinstated. And what did he do? He kept betting on baseball and doing appearances in casinos.
Jayson Stark's with us. Jay, I want to ask you where you stand, because I think so many people look at this as, first off, I think people intertwine the Hall of Fame and baseball as one. The Hall of Fame and Major League Baseball does not run the Hall of Fame, and that's where it seems like I feel like baseball or the Hall of Fame, when you go to a museum, you want the story told. You want the history. You're leaving out a part of the game's history, and I don't think you should reinstate him in the game, but do you think the museum should tell the story of Pete Rose?
Well, this is what I feel and have felt for a long time now. Just to get to that distinction that you made, Rob Manfred has always said from day one that he saw a distinction between the Hall of Fame and reinstatement. So whether Pete ever gets on anyone's Hall of Fame ballot is not baseball's call. It's the Hall of Fame's call. I think that's irrelevant, because if he ever gets on the Veterans Committee ballot, whatever it looks like at any given moment, they'll never elect him. The Veterans Committee doesn't elect anybody. It's just a dysfunctional process. So Pete Rose isn't going to get inducted to the Hall of Fame. He's never going to stand in that podium in Cooperstown and wave to the cheering throngs. That's a sad thing to me, too. But should he be in? I agree with you. What kind of Hall of Fame is it if you don't have the guy who got the most hits in history, the man who hit the most home runs in history, the man who won the most Cy Youngs in history, the man who broke Roger Maris's record, and then the man who broke his record? We could go on and on here, but I just don't see where a century from now people will understand how that happened. I would say elect players to the Hall of Fame, and then just be honest about it. Pete Rose got more hits than anyone who ever lived, but that's all the plaque has to say.
Yeah, we're talking about Jayson Stark, the great ESPN columnist, about Pete Rose and the Baseball Hall of Fame. Jason, that's always been my issue. There are two different things from my perspective. Pete Rose should be banned from baseball, working in baseball. And I don't even believe when he is put in the Hall of Fame, if he ever is, and you mentioned you don't think it's going to happen, he shouldn't be allowed to give a speech at Cooperstown. But the plaque should be in the Hall of Fame. You use the word tale to describe Pete Rose and how sad it is. Sad, happy, indifferent. It's a tale. It's a story about this game's history. And the fact that he's not involved, to me, makes the Hall of Fame irrelevant. It really does.
Well, I don't think irrelevant is the word I would use, but it's flawed because I think that for us to pretend that the Hall of Fame is the Hall of Purity is ridiculous. It's naive. There are a lot of people in the Hall of Fame that we should be kicking right out the door, ripping their plaques off the wall if we're looking for purity. And this is the issue that we run into every year, people like me who have to vote. People tell me, oh, you should keep all the cheaters out. Well, tell me who all the PED users were. Every one of them. I'll be happy to not vote for any of them. But the problem is we don't know. There's too much we don't know. So I'm really with you. I think that what the Hall of Fame should do, as Mike said, is tell the story of the period in history when Major League Baseball was played. That's what history museums do. And to pretend that this is some sort of sacrosanct place, that it's the Vatican, that's just not realistic.
Jay, I know John's got a question. I've said many times, it's not heaven. It's the Hall of Fame. It's a museum. It's a museum.
Well, Jason, that's what I was going to – I mean, you're a voter. Does the Baseball Hall of Fame get in trouble with that morals clause? Should they just remove it? Because it shouldn't be an issue. As you mentioned, this is not a church. This is just a history museum. And I think a lot of people take that particular instruction, whatever you want to call it, and use it for their own, for lack of a better word, I used this word earlier, activism, and what they want to put over as a statement. Do you think that should be removed as a hurdle?
Well, it's a character and integrity clause, and it's been part of the instructions to the voters for 80 years. So, to think we can snap our fingers, John, and make it go away, that ain't going to happen. The Hall of Fame is subtly trying to take a stand on players it doesn't want to be enshrined without ever saying it or overtly taking that stand. They're doing it with that clause. They're doing it with the 10-player limit. You can only vote for 10, even though qualified candidates are really stacking up now to the point where if you want to vote how you guys are describing, how I'm describing, you can't vote that way anymore. There's more than 10 names on the ballot who are deserving if you just want to go by what players accomplished. And it's really discouraging to be part of this process, and I'm saying that as somebody who really loved it for a long time. But it stopped being a baseball conversation, and it's turned into a morality conversation. I really didn't sign up for the morality police force, but I was surrounded by people who did.
Jayson Stark's with us here. Obviously, Pete Rose, Rob Manfred, the commissioner, upheld the decision to keep him out, and now, of course, the debate re-emerges on whether he belongs in or not. And I think, that is the big conversation, Jason, as whether or not the Hall of Fame, as John kind of mentioned, is it a farce if you don't tell the story of this guy? And then, of course, it compounds to what's coming up with the Barry Bondses of the world. You got a guy like Mike Piazza, who I guess many people think he's a Hall of Famer, but he's not getting in because he's suspected. As you said, it's not your job to really judge these people. Do you think baseball needs to put in some sort of voting type or I guess the Hall of Fame needs to put in some sort of voting stipulations, not to make your judgment. Really, I mean, like for Mike Piazza not to be in there, I think is bizarre.
Well, I think he's on the verge of getting elected. Good chance he does get elected this year. And, since you bring that up, I did ask the commissioner earlier this year if he had any advice for all of us who have to vote on what we should do with the players from that era. And his answer to that was really interesting. What he said was he thinks that we should make a distinction as voters between players who, for example, tested positive once there was testing, or players for whom there was some level of proof that they used what they used, versus players where we're just guessing, where there really isn't any proof. He didn't mention Mike Piazza's name. He didn't mention Jeff Bagwell's name, but I can connect those dots. I think he's trying to say you can't vote if you just are playing a guessing game. You can't vote that way, but voters do it. And you raised something here, Mike, that I wanted to speak to. There's a real irony in this. At the same time that the Hall of Fame voters are doing everything they can to ostracize the great hitters of that era, what's happening in baseball? Barry Bonds just got a job as a hitting coach. Mark McGwire just got a job as a bench coach. Think of the players who find themselves being welcomed back into the sport by the sport at the same time that Hall of Fame voters are going out of their way to keep them out of Cooperstown. I find that incredibly ironic.
That's a great point, Jayson. And John and I brought up, can baseball, and it's kind of like what I was asking you, I said, all right, you want to end this now, put some stipulations in. If you get caught using PEDs from this point forward, you are no longer allowed to be recognized. No more All-Star games. You can't be any postseason awards. You can't win an MVP, and you can't be on a ballot. And your salary will forever stay at the veterans minimum. How about that? Because a lot of these guys use PEDs to get that big contract, to get the MVP, to get the accolades. What if you put those rules in to really deter people from using it?
Well, I mean, that's never going to happen.
No.
Sorry, we don't live in that perfect world. If we're going to do that, then I want to see the other sports do it, okay?
Yeah.
Think of all the suspensions we see in the NFL, and nobody even blinks. Nobody even bats an eye.
True.
And those guys, what happens when a player gets suspended for 4 games for testing positive in football? What do people say? Wow, when's he going to get back and help my fantasy team? In baseball, you want to keep him from making money, from working, from being honored in any way. It's too difficult to go down that road because this is a complicated issue that people want to oversimplify. We could get into this for hours someday, but the more I think about it, learn about it, the more complicated it gets. Even while people on Twitter, and probably the people that call you, would love to make it simple. Black and white, you cheat, you're out, you're done. Just not realistic, man.
Yeah. Yeah, Jayson, in fact, I think it's such a slippery slope. I go in the other direction, and I say open the doors to everyone. I think 50 years from now, it's tougher to explain why Barry Bonds isn't in the Hall of Fame, why Roger Clemens isn't, why Alex Rodriguez isn't. To me, we can't prove certain things, and to my knowledge, correct me if I'm wrong, A-Rod has never failed an MLB-administered drug test. Maybe if there was an investigative reporter on the tail of another star that we think is clean, the story would be different for them. I have no way of knowing that. So why don't we just let everybody in and explain this is the PED era?
John, you're preaching to the choir on this because I really think that is what we should do. We should have the Hall of Fame try to explain every era because there were different conditions that colored the numbers of every era in baseball history. There was a long time where black players could not play Major League Baseball, correct? Where's the sign that explains that Babe Ruth and the players of that era never played against African Americans? Won't find one. So I would think that it would be in the Hall's best interest to try to put every era in some sort of context. The other thing here is, when you listen to the conversation from fans, you'd think 12, 15 players in history used steroids, and they're all home run hitters. When in fact, when you think back on that era, hundreds of players were using something for all sorts of reasons. It was the culture of the times. Not everyone was doing it to quote-unquote cheat or break a record. A lot of them were using what they were using because they were hurt and they wanted to get back on the field and help their team win, right? Or they were trying to stay in the big leagues or reach the big leagues or support their families, get that one big contract. There's a lot of stuff going on. Look, there are many players that used because everybody else was using. And as I said, I just think people have this simplified view of this era that a certain segment of sluggers were cheating to try to break all the greatest records in sports. Those records fell, and that's a sad story. But there were many players using all sorts of different stuff for all sorts of different reasons.
Jayson Stark, Friday I was on my way to Baltimore, and I happened to catch you on the radio talking about the Phillies trade. At that time, the trade was a little different than the one that ended up being announced. And it seemed like, from what I was listening to you say, well, it seemed like other teams thought that, hey, why didn't they take our call? We might have offered more. Did you like the finished product trade better than the original one that was reported?
Well, the biggest substitution was Derek Fisher, the outfielder who had a little pop, was subtracted from the package, and Mark Appel, the former number one pick in the draft, 24-year-old right-handed pitcher, was included in the package. And so you basically asked me, do I like Mark Appel or Derek Fisher? And I'm not sure that Mark Appel, despite his credentials, is a better prospect than Derek Fisher. So let me try to explain my reservation about that deal. And that's in its previous form and this form. I understand the reason that Matt Klentak and Andy McPhail decided it was time to trade Ken Giles, and I agree with the reason. I'm just not quite understanding the reason to make this trade at this time when there was no sense of urgency to move this guy. Mark Appel's inclusion in the deal doesn't, in and of itself, make it a vastly better trade. It makes it more intriguing, I'll say that. Really interesting that he's now in the package. But I still wonder whether if they had waited, would they have done better? Could they have done better? Could they have done better if they'd waited until July? There's just nobody in the who I would view as a star in the making. And that's the part of it that surprises me, because I think Ken Giles has a chance to be kind of a Craig Kimbrell light.
It's interesting because, and I know we're going to let Jayson go after this one here. Everybody is ripping, and the outrage over what the Sixers have done has just turned into a national conversation. Where in baseball, realistically, I mean, Scott Profrock came on here yesterday and said, look, we have no intentions of winning. Now, Giles, he said, he's the difference in us losing 90 games or 100 games. What's the difference? They traded a guy in the prime of his career for quote-unquote prospects, which is essentially the same as the Sixers trading a guy for draft picks. Just in baseball, you can't trade for draft picks, so they use the word prospects instead. Are the Phillies, I don't want to say tanking, but are they admitting that we're not trying to win? How dare them?
I don't think they're tanking. I think they're being honest about where they are. And I would endorse that. I'm not a big fan of tanking. A team that's tanking is a team that doesn't have anybody on its roster older than 24 years old, right? That just is trying to accumulate high picks. I don't think that's what the Phillies are doing. The Phillies, how many times did you and I talk about the state of the farm system before last July? And we talked about how barren it was. Well, it's not barren anymore. They've added a lot of players, and especially a lot of arms at the upper level, who greatly improve the depth and the quality of their system. And so I understand that part of it. That had to happen.
Yeah.
that's what people wanted Ruben to do a long time ago. The problem is that they're now at the point where there's really nobody left to trade, and they still, to me, need difference makers. There are a lot of players who are going to play in the big leagues. Where are the players who are going to propel them to be a better team than the Mets, better than the Nationals, better than what the Braves are building, better than what the Marlins are building, for that matter? I'm not saying it's impossible, but there's going to need to be an infusion of difference-making players, and that's the step they haven't taken. And it's why, all right, they've got the number 1 pick in the draft. They got to nail that one.
Sure do. Jason's got a Q&A tonight up in Center City, Shy Vintage Sports. If you're heading up that way, it's from 6 to 8. A lot of our listeners in the Wilmington, Dover, Camden County areas, Gloucester County, if you're up that way. Jason, the Q&A, 6 to 8 tonight, Shy Vintage Sports. Well, my man, happy holidays to you, and hopefully right after the baseball season, after the new year, we can catch up again and see if Matt Klintak has made any more earth-shattering moves.
I would say he's not done, they're not done.
Good.
And we're not done, man. It's, the work never ends, does it? There's no off-season. There's no off and off-season for us.
No, but a lot of people were criticizing Manfred for making this decision now when it was the middle of football season. He could have stolen the headlines right in, like, March with this announcement on Pete Rose. But it gave us a great reason to catch up with you, Jay.
Always a pleasure, man. Happy holidays to you.